The 5 isles to the south of Barra, namely Vatersay, Sandray, Pabay, Mingulay and Berneray, also called the Bishop's Isles, and this is a short video of kayaking amongst them. The trip itself starts in Castle Bay. Each year, the Catholic priest holds a mass in the back of a local lorry to bless all the fishing boats in the harbour. The kayak trip then goes across the harbour past Kissamall Castle and over to the north side of Vatersay Island itself. The island is blessed with many white beaches all along its northern shore. You then go through a couple of skerries on the very northeast side and into Vatersay Bay is a very deep bay with a large white beach at the end of it. This beach is on an isthmus which separates the north half and the south half of Vatersay. It's on the south half of Vatersay where the village itself is. Along the south coast of Vatersay there are a number of small other little coves and beaches which border onto the Kyles or the Sound of Sandray. This relatively shallow, kilometre-wide sound separates the islands of Vatersay and Sandray. It often has quite a good tide flowing through it. Sometimes this can be up to a couple of knots. Sandray has 3 beaches altogether. There's one on the northwest corner and 2 on the east side. On the east side, the 2 beaches, which are about a kilometre apart, are connected by huge dunes. Some of these dunes are 40 metres high. The dunes are now largely covered in marram grass, although there's a lot of areas of bare sand. Sandray is uninhabited with just a few sheep and many rabbits, which are found on the island. South of the sand dunes on the east side are a couple of craggy headlands with rocky islets off them. Between them, the swell and the tide surge, making it quite choppy in all but the mildest of weather. The south side of Sandray is far more craggy and exposed, with no real landing possibilities for kayakers. Beyond the south side is the 4-kilometre wide Sound or Kyles of Pabay, which separates the islands of Sandray and Pabay. This stretch of water can be rough, as the tide can surge through here at up to 3 knots. However, this was not the case for me, as I crossed at slack water, and although there was a gentle 2-metre swell, there was virtually no wind as I crossed over the Sound of Pabay to a peninsula on the east side of this island. This peninsula, called Rosinish, has some submerged skerries just off the south tip, and these cause the occasional swells to erupt into crashing waves, which would catch out the unwary. The beach at Barn Bay, or White Bay, is the only place to land on Pabay. It is a 300-metre crescent of dazzling white sand, flanked by outcrops at each end. It does not offer much protection from a southerly swell. However, there's an outcrop at the south side of the beach, and this might allow for an easier landing if the swell is over a metre. Pabay, like Mingulay and Berneray further south, is owned by the National Trust for Scotland. There's plenty of camping here on the grassy shelf above the sands to the south of the ruined house. This house was built in 1890 for the Morrison family, but 20 years later, in 1910, everybody left Pabay and the house was just used seasonally to graze the 100-odd sheep. There's an easy walk up to the highest point, called the Hoe, at 171 metres, where there are great views across the 3-kilometre wide Sound of Mingulay to Mingulay Island itself. After spending my first night on peaceful Pabay, I woke to a glorious day. I packed up to head over the Sound of Mingulay to the next island. The surf in the bay was a spent force now, and the launch off the white sands and across the turquoise water was very easy. Initially, the trip down the east side of Pabay should be easy. But as you round the headland of Rubicharnain, you suddenly find yourself thrust into the Sound of Mingulay. Here, tides can get up to 4 knots, so if there's any swell or wind around, you can expect a rough ride, with the steep south coast of Pabay offering no protection. I was fortunate to cross this at slack water in calm weather, with just the odd fog bank around. As one approaches Mingulay, the seabirds increase in number as there are many colonies on this island. If the tide is flooding, there will also be overfalls to the east of the rocky islets at the north tip of Mingulay, and these could be rough. Once past the overfalls, the east coast of Mingulay Island should be more protected. After a couple of headlands, where there might be some tidal currents, the golden stands of Mingulay Bay appear. This magnificent half-kilometre wide crescent of sand is the only landing spot on Mingulay. This east-facing beach is not protected, and even with a westerly swell, the waves can refract round the whole island and crash onto the beach in a big surf. I was lucky. Not only was there no swell, but I was greeted by the beaming smile of Gordon Ross, who was another solo kayaker out here for a few days. As with Pabe, the whole island is owned by the National Trust for Scotland, so wild camping is permitted in most places, but the grassy shelves above the south end of the beach are probably the best place. Near this camp spot is the old schoolhouse where the children from the village of nearly 150 souls were educated until the island was abandoned 100 years ago. With fog banks still rolling across the sea, I spent the third day exploring Mingulay on foot. On the southwest of the island is the steep peninsula of Dun Mingulay, with an old Iron Age fort atop it. From here the view south was across the bay to the rocky Girum Islets, and then across the Sound of Barra was Barra Island, with Barra Head Lighthouse sitting on top some 200 metres above the Atlantic. To the north of Dun Mingulay were the huge sea stacks of Gunnamull, Arnamull and Lianamull, between which were vast caves, arches and chasms, which makes the coastal architecture here world-class. Back on the east side of Mingulay, I spent the evening at the puffin colony above the main beach. Here some 2,000 birds live in burrows on the sandy soil of the hillside. These puffins spend all autumn and winter leading a solitary life on the open ocean, bobbing about in the Atlantic. Each spring they gather at the place where they fledged, and it is only then that they meet their monogamous partners again. The puffins then lay a single white egg in their burrows, which both male and female incubate for nearly a month and a half. The chicks, called pufflings, take about a month and a half to fledge. They fledge at night, tumble into the sea, swim away from the shore, and will not return to land for a couple of years. During the breeding months, the puffins travel up to 50 kilometres offshore to collect fish for the pufflings in the burrows, returning in the evening with moustaches of sand eels. They often circle the colony before landing to make sure there are no predators about. Puffins are especially vulnerable to great skewers, a parasitic thug which lives off the eggs, chicks and adults of other birds. On my fourth day, Gordon Ross and myself teamed up to explore the west coast of Mingulay. We headed up, going anti-clockwise around the island, and paddled up the sunny east coast to reach the rocky Solent Islets. Here the ebbing tide was surging through the gap with a good 7-knot current. It carried us along and spilled us into the Sound of Mingulay itself. As there was no swell in the Sound, there was little turbulence, otherwise this is a tricky junction. A few hundred metres later on the very north tip of Mingulay, is a remarkable rust-coloured sea stack called Red Boy, which had a few spiky siblings around it. Red Boy was spectacular, but we both knew it was just the hors d'oeuvre. The main course was after we had paddled along the north side of Mingulay, which was 2 kilometres of unbroken cliff. Rounding the northwest corner of Mingulay, we were suddenly face to face with a vast 100-metre-high sea stack of solid gneiss called Lianamull. This stack was really impressive, but as we paddled to explore the inside of it, a jaw-dropping chasm opened. This chasm separated Lianamull from Mingulay itself. It was only a few metres wide, but about 300 metres long. On each side, the sheer walls rose up for about 100 metres, creating a narrow slot. To make it even more dramatic, the slot had a slight angle to it, with the sea stack side overhanging slightly, so it was not possible to see the sky from the depths of this chasm. I set off apprehensively down the chasm, hoping a rogue swell would not appear and surge down the slot in a frothing wall of surf, as any swell out there would be amplified in this chasm. It took a good few minutes to paddle the length of it, and burst out into the bright sunlight on the south side. Once Gordon emerged from the slot, we went round the stack again, passing a kittiwake colony in a large cave entrance. Kittiwakes are pelagic birds, that is, birds who spend most of their life on the ocean, only coming ashore to breed. The kittiwakes return to their breeding sites on steep cliff ledges in early spring, forming large, noisy colonies, sometimes with as many as 1,000 pairs, and then they leave again in late summer. We continued round the stack and approached the north side of it again. Just before we got there, we noticed a cave entrance with a chink of light at the far end of it. There was obviously a tunnel right under the whole stack, which emerged into the vast chasm we had just paddled down. We sat at the entrance, bobbing about in the clappertus, and trying to peer into the dark depths of the tunnel to see how the swell was behaving in there. We let a few sets go through, and nothing looked too alarming. I was wary, but Gordon was up for it, and set off down the entrance undaunted. It took nearly a minute before we disappeared round the corner and seemed to emerge unscathed into the vast chasm at the other end of the tunnel. I set off and soon passed the jaws of the entrance and into the heaving throat of the tunnel. The swell was rising and falling a good few metres in here. When it rose, it would swirl around the dark, unseen corners to the side, erupting in a menacing way as it hit the roof of these side passages. With the adrenaline starting to pump, I was discharged into the relative calm of the chasm again. We paddled out of the chasm and into a deep bay, actually more of a cleft than a deep bay. As we paddled between the sheer walls where guillemots and razorbills nested, we passed under the 220-metre high cliffs of Bull na Craig. These sheer cliffs are some of the highest in the British Isles. We left these huge cliffs and headed further south towards the stacks of Animal and Gunamal and the rocky peninsula of Dun Mingulay, where I had walked yesterday. Firstly, we entered the wide chasm between the stack of Animal and Mingulay. It was impressive, but not in the same jaw-dropping category of half an hour earlier by the Animal stack. However, as we went further in, we could see the smaller stack of Gunamal was not quite an isolated stack, but was connected to Mingulay with a huge arch. Below this arch was a wide tunnel, some 5 metres wide, through which we could easily paddle. In fact, with the sea in this state, it would probably be easy enough to have taken a small fishing boat through here. The arch seemed to have been formed by the sea eroding a basalt dike which had been intruded into the hardened ice on each side. The basalt dike had been eroded away by wave action, leaving this hole. Looking up as we emerged on the other side of the tunnel, we could see the sea cliffs rising straight up for a good 100 metres on all sides except one, which was the top of the deep slot between Gunamal and the peninsula of Dun Mingulay. We now turned west to paddle down the dark waters at the bottom of this slot and out into the Atlantic again. On our left here was Dun Mingulay, the large promontory with sea cliffs on all sides except for the narrow isthmus. Across the neck of the isthmus were the remains of an old wall which defended the 2,000-year-old Iron Age fort. The fort has now long disappeared under the heather and grass, and it is now seabirds which rule here, nesting on the steep sides or in the burrows on top. The cliffs on the west tip of the peninsula were largely free of nesting birds and were a prime rock climbing venue for the few connoisseurs who made the journey out here to climb on its clean gneiss. Rounding the tip of this peninsula, we entered a large open bay on its south side. Here we got a view of Barra at the very end of this island chain. The bay itself was calm and sunny today, and many of the seabirds nesting on the adjacent cliffs were now collected into large rafts, with many hundreds of puffins, guillemots and razorbills mingling. After cruising through them gently, we turned south towards the Girium Islands, beyond which was the Sound of Barra and Barra Island itself. We crossed the Sound of Barra in unusually calm conditions, passing on the inside of a skerry called Shelter Rock. This skerry had about 10 seals basking on it, who shuffled into the water as we approached. Just beyond Shelter Rock is the concrete jetty. We had to land on the rocks beside the jetty, as the tide was too low to use it. After a quick lunch, we headed off to go around Barra, this time going clockwise. Rounding the east tip, we started along the south coast in superb conditions. Firstly, we had to cross the open Tressiburg Bay, which despite the name would not provide any shelter in rough conditions, as it is wide open to the south. As we approached Cuvec Point, crossing the bay in very calm conditions, we quietly crept along the skerries and here managed to sneak up on some seals basking in the sun. They only saw us at the last minute, then most bounced into the water. During the winter months, when there are very few fishing boats and other people around, many of these scattered pods of seals collect into a huge colony of 2,000–3,000 animals and in the undisturbed beach at Mingulay. The next landmark was the buttress of Rubber Gralish, which was the southern tip of Barra, called Barra Head. There were a few submerged rocks just offshore here, and had there been any swell, they would have been erupting violently. We just had to contend with the incoming tide, which was swirling around the rocks. The tide here can run up to 3 knots in springs, and as we are right in the middle third of a spring, it was running at about 3 knots. Just after these rocks was the buttress of Barra Head itself. It was not as high as the headlands which followed, and was well under 100 metres. Rounding Barra Head, we turned the corner and now started up the southwest coast of Barra. This was the most impressive section, and it culminated in the massive buttress of Skate Point at the west tip. The cliffs along this section were just shy of 200 metres, and many rose straight out to the sea. There were some clefts in the rock along the base of the cliffs, but no real caves. Occasionally there was the rare rock which had not been smashed by the Atlantic storms yet, and I could sneak inside them, admiring the guillemot and razorbill colonies on the cliffs above me. It is a rare event that the seas here allow kayakers to thread their way through these rocks. As I emerged from the rocks, I reached the cliffs which drop straight into the sea from the lighthouse nearly 200 metres above me on the plateau at Cape Point. There were no rocks here to break up the swell, and the water was deep. In a storm, the clappertus of the rebounding swell must have been phenomenal. Indeed, the lighthouse keepers claimed that fish were occasionally swept up and blown up from these vertical cliffs during storms. As we rounded Cape Point, the island of Mingulay reappeared from behind the daunting cliffs. Ross and myself now parted company, with him returning back to the beach at Mingulay, while I landed on Barra to explore it further. From the jetty on the north side of Barra, there's a 2-kilometre path which traverses up the island to the lighthouse, offering great views to Mingulay and the Girum islets. This important lighthouse, built in 1830, marks the southern entrance to the Minch. It was manned for 150 years, right up to 1980. From the lighthouse itself, one can get a better grasp of the sheer size of the cliffs on Barra. These huge gneiss walls, with their small ledges, are a haven for seabirds, which can breed here while taking full advantage of their proximity to the staple diet of small fish nearby. However, the ongoing commercial exploitation of these small fish for animal fodder, salmon farm food, and even fertilizer has depleted their once plentiful supply so much the seabird colonies can no longer sustain themselves and their populations are in decline. After a walk round the now solar-powered lighthouse, the previous keeper's burial ground, and the island's freshwater spring, it was time to head back across the Sound of Barra to Mingulay. Landing on the beach, I settled in for another night, with the rasp of about 5 corn crates coming from the nearby flag iris clusters. Mingulay and Barra are one of the last breeding strongholds of these rare shy birds in the UK. On the 5th day the weather was even better, with a flat glassy sea. Indeed, the sea was so calm you could spot seabirds gently paddling on the surface from nearly a kilometre away. I decided to head north, but wanted to go round Barra and Mingulay one more time en route back up to Pabay, Sandray and Vatersay. I crossed the Sound of Barra to the east tip of Barra, with the ebbing tide carrying me round into Trasibeg Bay. Here I sneaked up on the seals again. All the seals I had encountered so far on this trip were grey seals. They were larger than the common seals and have Roman noses and flared nostrils. The grey seals generally have their pups in the late autumn, typically November, while the common seals have theirs in the summer, so I knew I would not be disturbing any vulnerable seal pups at this time of year. Had they been common seals, it would have been imperative to give them a far wider berth. Before long I reached Barra Head at the southern tip of Barra. By comparison, the cliffs on this buttress were modest compared to those further west along the south coast. This jaw-dropping coastline started just a little further with Sirin Mora, translated as the Big Crest, whose massive buttress of clean, firm gneiss soared straight out of the deep ocean to 150 metres. I had not fully noticed its glory yesterday, but now sat in my kayak marvelling at it, as it towered above me, with some small, scattered clusters of seabirds nesting on its ledges. I continued west, under the cliffs at Soton to Cape Point, where the lighthouse stood far above me. It was quite exceptional to cruise along the base of these cliffs without a care in the world, watching guillemots sunbathing on the rocky spurs. According to maritime charts, the seabed just here at the bottom of these cliffs was about 100 metres deep, so the gigantic swell of Atlantic storms would have crashed unimpeded into the base of these cliffs. The rebounding smell must cause clappertus of biblical proportions. Soon Mingulay reappeared as the curtain of Cape Point withdrew, and I headed across the Sound of Barra to it, reaching the Girum islets on the other side first. There was a strong ebbing tide flowing around them, and I had to fight my way up against the current on the south side of the larger Girum islet to reach the gap between it and the smaller Girum islet. Here the tide was now in my favour, and it carried me into the bay on the south side of Dun Mingulay Peninsula. As I paddled over this calm bay to the cliffs at the western tip of Dun Mingulay, I had to cleave a route through the large rafts of mixed seabirds which were relaxing here. At the tip of this peninsula there were virtually no seabirds nesting. It was possibly too exposed for them even in the summer. The winter storms would also lash this cliff severely, removing any loose rock, so the whole 100-metre high gneiss cliff was clean and firm, and it was this section which was popular with the hardy rock climbers who made the long journey out here. Once past these climbers' cliffs, I was back into the prime, and the sea stacks of Arnamol and Gunnamol were right in front of me. Initially, I paddled into the chasm between Mingulay and Gunnamol, and then turned north, passing through the tunnel under the huge arch connecting Mingulay Island with Gunnamol Stack. The arch was not too wide or long, but it was perhaps 100 metres high. The glassy dark waters were deep here, but in this extraordinary weather I could go exactly where I wanted. I continued north until a cleft opened up to my right, cutting a deep slot into Mingulay Island itself, while on my left there was a chasm which separated Gunnamol Stack from the larger stack of Arnamol. I did not go down it, but continued north between Arnamol and Mingulay for a few hundred metres until the entrance to a narrow cave appeared. Ross and myself could not get into it yesterday due to the swell, but it was very accessible today. I set off down into the cave, which soon revealed a chink of light at the far end. One of the joys of sea kayaking is exploring these watery caverns. When they suddenly unveil side passages and other entrances, there's always an added sense of wonder. This unexpected tunnel, which led off from a huge cavernous chamber, like the inside of a cathedral, was a bonus. The exit at the far end was a narrow slot, and it would have been a churning froth in any swell. Passing through it, I entered a deep cleft in Mingulay, which I could now paddle out of. As I paddled down the cleft, more rock structures, which had been formed by the violent Atlantic swell, revealed themselves, while the jaw-dropping chasm from yesterday was half a kilometre ahead of me. Next I paddled past the 210-metre high north-facing and green cliffs in another deep cleft. Then I headed towards the Lion's Head on Lianamol Stack and the start of the vast chasm. I intended to paddle up the length of this chasm while filming one continuous frame, just to give an idea as to its colossal size. Despite my intentions to go down the whole chasm, I suddenly had the notion to dive into the tunnel when it appeared, but I continued to film. As I exited the tunnel, I turned to the right just to have one last look at this incredible natural marvel, which to me was the architectural highlight of the entire trip. I then said goodbye to the remarkable west coast of Mingulay and paddled round Rubagurse headland to the north side of the island. It was a good 2 kilometres along the craggy coast to the north tip of Mingulay, with continuous cliffs descending like a curtain from the green grassy slopes above on McPhee's Hill. Centuries ago, a rent collector called McPhee arrived to collect the annual rent. McPhee went ashore while others stayed in the boat. McPhee found the entire population of the island had died of plague and returned to tell the others. They abandoned him immediately on Mingulay with just corpses for company. Daily, McPhee would climb these grassy slopes, signalling to passing ships who would ignore him. After a year, the landowner, seeing McPhee had survived, resettled the island and granted McPhee land as compensation. Past the slopes under McPhee's hill was the stack of Red Boy and his smaller siblings. The ebbing tide was flowing fast against me as I paddled up the channels between these rust-coloured spires. I now paddled north across the Sound of Mingulay to the rocky island of Outer Hebrides. As I crossed the Sound of Mingulay, the ebbing tide was carrying me west, and I had to ferry glide across the kilometre-wide passage. As I approached Outer Hebrides, I noticed that it was not a single island, but a cluster of some 5 storm-lashed rocks with deep channels between them, which the ebbing tide was now ripping through. I made for a channel between the easternmost of these rocky islets. The tide was flowing like a river against me. As I went up the channel, I could see a rock at the far end on which some 20 grey seals were basking. None of them noticed me, and I managed to sneak up to within some 10 metres of these 300-kilo animals before the alarm was raised. Some which had already passed stayed put, but the rest bounced into the water in an avalanche of frightened blubber. I now headed across to Outer Hebrides, which was just a kilometre east and lay off the southwest corner of Outer Hebrides is composed of 3 fingers of rocky islets, a couple of 100 metres long. Between them were wide channels where the tide was flowing with great force, despite it being in the last third of the ebb. And a big northwest swell, this would be an inferno of giant haystack waves. I reached the end of the southerly finger, and then blasted across the 100-metre wide tide race to the eddies at the end of the middle finger, then across the next tide race to the northern finger across another 100 metres of determined dark water. Finally, from the northern finger of Outer Hebrides, I blasted over to Outer itself, which was a 200-metre tide channel where the current was perhaps running the strongest. Once at Outer, there were rocky headlands to tuck behind under the massive Great Arch on Outer. This Great Arch was immaculate nice and is a revered climber's crag with an E8 route right up the middle of it. From the Great Arch, I paddled up the craggy west coast of Outer. I passed a deep cleft called Sloch Glanish, where there was once an illicit whisky still. A bit further was the northwest headland of Outer, called Allanish, where the ebbing tide was still noticeable, despite it being just half an hour from slack water at the tide's turn. I paddled round Allanish and into the open bay on the north side of Outer. There was another cleft here, called Sloch Granda, which I paddled towards, weaving my way through the boulders guarding its entrance and over the fronds of exposed oarweed, a kelp which generally only appears at low spring tides. Once in this deep cleft, I could eat a relaxed lunch while the loud calls of the black guillemots, or tice, echoed in this dark chasm. These birds are a distinct species from the common guillemot, and are much more solitary than gregarious, seldom forming groups of 5 or more. They nest in isolated rock crevices rather than in colonies on ledges like their common cousins. After lunch, I paddled north for 10 minutes to the island of Lingay, which sat in the middle of the Sound of Outer. The tide was turning now, so there was not much current. Lingay has a cave on its southeast corner, but it looked unimpressive. Paddling past its craggy east side, I continued a kilometre north to Flodday. This island was composed of a few steep rocky islets. I paddled up the craggy west side and round the gentler north side, before setting a course due east to the beach on the northwest corner of Sandray, where I hoped to camp at the end of my 5th day. As I approached the beach, a sea-eagle flew off. It was feeding on the stinking carcass of a sheep. The smell and clegs forced me off this otherwise pristine spot, and I decided to head to Castle Bay. The Sound of Sandray was a mirror, as I paddled across it, to the skerries on the east tip of Battersea Island. Round the east tip I entered sheltered waters, and off these the protected Castle Bay harbour, with its iconic Kissimmel Castle. The small town was spread out across the shores of this bay. I checked into the hostel and watched the ferry dock in the evening. Early the next day, this ferry would take me back to Oban.